On behalf of the Center for Theories in Historical Research, I would like to welcome you all this evening, and especially our guests, Achim Landwehr, Professor for Early Modern History at the University of Düsseldorf, and our Reinhard Koselleck guest professor, Ethan Kleinberg. Thank you so much for your time and energy in participating. Tonight, the Theory Center is a guest of the Colloquium Research Area Cultures of History, focusing on the third Domino talk. Before we start, let me say a few words about the Domino talk format. In our context, the game of Domino represents a theoretical topic that brings two scholars together like two different domino pieces. At the heart of their exchange is a recent publication on a theoretical question discussed from two points of view. The author presents his or her new book, to which an expert gives a commentary. This theory game is carried over in the following semester. The said author is once again invited to the Theory Center, but this time in the capacity of expert, whose turn it is to scrutinize a new theoretical book with its author. Last time, Sina Steglitz, who presented her book Zeit or Achim, presented the book Diesseits der Geschichte, written by Achim, and now Achim presents the book Emmanuel Levinas, Talmudic term, written by Ethan. As I said earlier, Achim is professor of early modern history at the University of Düsseldorf. In addition to his expertise on this topic, Achim has extensive expertise in theories of history, and together with Ethan, is one of the most authoritative and original voices in the field. He has devoted several theoretical studies to discourse analysis, culture history, and questions on the present and temporality in historical research. With the concept of chronoreference, he conceptualized how historians think about and establish relationships between the present and the past as no longer existent. How we can deal with the past as non-existent and thus impossible to reconstruct or find is a key question in Ethan's latest works. Ethan is class of 1958 distinguished professor of history and letters at Wesleyan University and editor-in-chief of the journal Theory in History. But unlike Achim, who imagines the chronoreferences of historians as the construction, and I quote Sina Steglitz, bridges between our temporal here and one more temporal theirs, Ethan moves from possible histories of groups and events that had previously resided as ghosts, and which haunt us as the dominant historical narrative. It is not the present that haunts the past, but the past that haunts us. In his new book on Levinas, which came out in October this year, Ethan suggests an experiment, juxtaposing two different and epistemologically incompatible pasts and temporalities. An experiment that aims to rethink or maybe to refine the possibility of ethics. So now we are very keen to hear your thoughts, and we'll begin with Ethan. The stage is yours.
So thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Achim, for braving the trains and everything else that stands in the way between Düsseldorf and Bielefeld. And as we know from this sort of strange and alienating setup with people here and people in the offices around and people everywhere else, it's sort of extraordinary time. So I do appreciate it. And I do appreciate the invitation to be here in Bielefeld and have the opportunity to talk to everyone here. What I'm going to try to do briefly, of course, when one talks about a new book, it's a book that one assumes most people haven't read. So I do want to set out what the basic coordinates of this book is, and some of the, I guess, problems I was trying to take on before moving into the more conversational part. So Emmanuel Levinas, a Lithuanian-born French philosopher, is a major figure in both philosophy and the field of Jewish studies, especially in France and the United States. And I know from talking in other venues that he holds a lesser stance in some places than others. But certainly in the United States and France, his star has risen in relation to his concern with ethics and his work on the category of the other. But something that's always perplexed me is that he has a kind of dual life in this scholarship, in which he's either taken up in philosophy departments, continental philosophy departments, or he's taken up in Jewish studies, and there's a real divide between what are considered his philosophical writing and what are considered his Jewish or confessional writing. And I became increasingly interested in the relation between the two, the nature of this divide, whether or not one led the other, whether one was interiorized in the other. And so I wanted to work this through, but along the way I realized there was an interesting, or I was interested in a question of intellectual history, which had to do with how he came to his interest in the study of Talmud. This is to say, how he moved from a focus on philosophy and specifically phenomenology and his training with Edmund Husserl and then with Martin Heidegger to this interest in these sacred Jewish texts. And one thing I discovered early on in my research is that there was a pervasive myth about Emmanuel Levinas. And this myth was that he was, because he came from Vilna, because he was raised in Lithuania, that he in fact had been trained in the Talmudic academies just outside that were so famous, and that thus he had learned the ways of reading the Talmud early, and it was part of his formation. And this turned out to not be true. Growing up in Vilna, he actually went to a gymnasium. He was interested in philosophical and literary questions. He certainly knew Hebrew, but he wasn't trained in the Lithuanian Talmudic tradition. As he found his way to France and became a French citizen, he became increasingly interested in questions of philosophy. And it's not until his time in a prisoner of war camp as a French soldier that he began to recalibrate. And this began in a confrontation with the philosophy of Heidegger, where he started trying to work out a category he called être juif, or being Jewish, as a way to move away from Heidegger's Dasein, and we can talk about that later. And after the war, in fact, that's when he came into contact with this very strange and enigmatic man who was a Talmudic master and also taught Elie Wiesel and others. And it's very strange and almost like the ghost of his past. So Levinas came to the study of Talmud at a time where he was trying to rethink some very difficult questions. And these are the questions I take up in the book. What it means to be a Jew after the Holocaust, what it means to construct anything like an ethics or a philosophical ethics after the Holocaust and the Second World War, and what, if anything, one can make of God after those events. What kind of God is one that you can have after you've experienced this, after your family's been killed, after many of your friends have been killed, after this town, these Talmudic academies have all been burned to the ground. And I argue in the book that he does so by creating what I call a post-rabbinic Talmudic tradition. That he builds or forges a path to this past, to this this tradition, this educational inheritance that he didn't take up in his youth, but does take up after the war. And he does so by weaving together what I call 3 strands of a braid. And this is what makes his Talmudic reading so interesting and so enigmatic, because it's composed of his interest in Western philosophy, specifically in phenomenology, in the kind of philosophy that was happening in France in the 30s and 40s and 50s. The other strand is what I refer to as French Universalism. And these really are the values of 1789 in a very idealized fashion of universalism, of equality, even in some way of laïcité, though in a strange manner. And this manifests in his work for a French Jewish school that actually was serving the areas of mostly North Africa. But the education was taught in French. So that would be the other strand. And then this third crucial strand is the return to Talmud. And this comes through this figure Shoshani and through his understanding of the problems of Talmud. And in building this braid, he actually comes up with a kind of transcendent logic, or a logic that meaning transcends time. And he has to come up with that if you think of it purely contextually, because these Talmudic academies are gone and the teachers are gone, and that tradition can't go on in a kind of face-to-face way. There has to be a way for the meanings that were in these texts to be restored, and he uses the metaphor of blowing on coals to make them come back to life. So that's the basic argument of the book. The last thing I'll say is it posed a huge problem for me in terms of both methodology and theory of history, because if I were to write it using traditional contextual modes, in essence, you deplete what is, I think, most powerful in Levinas's thought, and that's this transcendent mechanism, this sense that there are some things that don't work chronologically, that don't exist in time, that come from outside of time. And that's why I ended up organizing a book around these 2 different narratives. And I take up something that Levinas pulls from a Lithuanian rabbi, Achim of Volozhin, God on God's side and God on our side. God on God's side is this transcendent, infinite, non-representable being that we aren't able to contain in our own minds. But God comes to us on our side in various ways, and for Levinas it is through these sacred texts. And I wanted to try to allow the book to work in these 2 conflicting logics. One, on our side, in intellectual history, the other as this conduit to God's side, to allow the logic to be transcendent. Of course, whether this works or not, that's, I guess, under discussion. It certainly leads to an interesting form in a dual text book with 2 narratives lined up next to each other. And hopefully we'll talk about some or all or none of these things as we go along.
Okay.
Okay.
Shall I go on?
Yes.
Okay, without further ado. Okay, so it's my turn now to try and to comment on this project of Ethan and his book, and I have to confess that I was impressed, faced with this task, because I also have to confess that Emmanuel Levinas was not one of my usual night table bookshelf readings. I mean, I did read a bit by Levinas, but not that much. And most of all, I didn't have his writings and his philosophy not in an account of the history, the theory of history, and especially I did know almost nothing about his Talmudic lectures. So that was really something new to me, and an introduction, and I'm grateful for it, because I really learned a lot from it, and I also have some questions. But I'd like to make 4 points. Not 3 points, as it's usually done in comments like that, but 4 points. To make quite short, the first point is why Levinas. The second point is questions of form. The third point is questions of time, and the fourth point is again why Levinas' slight return. Emmanuel Levinas is, as I said, certainly not one of the standard theoretical philosophical references when it comes to debates on the theory of history. Apart from the fact that debates on the theory of history do not belong to any kind of standard in historiography, and that's a certain circumstance that makes the actual need for theory even more obvious, in my concern, references to Levinas are hardly ever found in these debates. Hence the question, why Levinas? Why this object as well as what, actually? What kind of object is it in this book here? As an object of intellectual history, as a sparring partner in matters of historical theory. So what can one learn from Levinas? And several answers are possible, and perhaps that would be also a motto to stand over this book in the first place. Several answers are possible. More on that in a moment. So, possible answer number one to the question why Levinas. Levinas here becomes the subject of a classical intellectual history, and also the subject of a no less classic demythification. Ethan was talking about that already, because Levinas was not trained as a Talmudic scholar, even though he came from Lithuania and thus from a stronghold of Talmudic scholarship. With this book, Ethan writes the story of the ways of thinking and working of a French intellectual in the 20th century. Possible answer number two, Levinas should become an object of historical theoretical reflection. And this is quite obvious on closer examination, because coming from Husserl and from Heidegger and from Bergson, the theme of time plays quite an important role in Levinas' philosophy, and his ethics, for which he is probably best known, can also be linked to questions of historical theory, for the closeness of the other in his otherness can be understood not only spatially, the other as something or someone that I'm going to meet in space, but also can be understood temporarily. But these answers are not really convincing, or they are not only convincing, because Ethan deals with these aspects of Levinas only marginally. He foregrounds the Talmud lectures, which as a topic must at first seem somewhat exotic, at least if one is not a scholar in religious studies. Hence, possible answer number three, this book is not about Levinas at all. It is about something completely different. That this book is about something different can already be seen from the form of presentation, and Ethan was talking about that already. For if one, I'm going to move to my second point now, questions of form. For if one were to ask whether Ethan is trying to tell a true story with his intellectual history of Levinas' Talmudic turn, one might answer that the question, one might answer this question in the affirmative when one opens the book. But it would also be worth adding, I don't know if you can see it, just to see the columns, the page with the two columns. It would also be worth adding that he's not trying to tell just one true story. He wants to tell at least two true stories. And probably there are even 3 or 4 true stories in it. To fit his subject, Ethan has divided the central chapters of the book, apart from the introduction and the conclusion, into 2 columns. On the one hand, he recounts the intellectual history on the left side, on the left column, the intellectual history of Levinas and his turn to and interpretation of the Talmud. And on the other, on the right side, he turns directly to the Talmud lectures and follows Levinas' transcendent, or rather excendent, to quote Levinas, excendent claims with a view to the past, to history, and to an ethical opening towards the other. So we see the book is not about Levinas at all, although it's about nothing but Levinas all the time. It is rather about the question of how one can still write history. And the book is about the theme that questions of form are much more than formal questions. This seems to me to be a central concern for historical representation, in particular because a certain dominant conception of the collective singular is combined with an equally dominant standardized form of representation. And Ethan breaks this down, or breaks it up, using what is ultimately, let's say, a simple trick, working with the two columns, and one that has been practiced already elsewhere, but usually not in the field of historiography. In my view, we need other stories, and for that we need other ways of describing history, other ways of describing the world. Academia could learn a lot from the arts, in this case, from novels, films, visual arts, and clearly more daring approaches would be truly necessary. Why not dare more experiments with such forms of representation, like Ethan did? But questions remain with regard to the book and also to the form. Why did Ethan avoid the column solution for the introduction and for the conclusion? Does the authoritative voice of the historian speak there again, after all? Does it become unambiguous there again, after all, in the introduction and in the conclusion? And secondly, if there are two sides, God on our side, God on God's own side, then where is Ethan's side? Or to put it another way, who actually determines the white stripe between the two columns, the difference, the blank in between, who sets the difference between one side and the other? Is the author present? That's another question. Okay, my third point, question of time. And of course, as you already noticed, I told you nonsense earlier. Of course, this book is about Levinas, about what else? And quite centrally and in every respect, it is about Levinas. For in choosing his subject matter, as well as his choice of form, Ethan is, I think, asking a much more fundamental question, and he's telling us so in his introduction. And this question is secular historiography, aiming at pure immanence, the only conceivable one? Or is there still the possibility to think with Levinas and his Talmudic lectures of a transcendent historiography? I would even go a bit further with this question, because in my view, transcendence has never left historical work. The religious moment has only taken another form, the form of history itself, of history as the collective singular. What's necessary, therefore, would be to insist on a radical immanence of the historical in order to gain a new transcendence from it. Thus, a new ethics of the historical, of history, of historiography, could be formulated, but one that does not start from presuppositionless presuppositions. And God or the history are examples for these presupposition. That's difficult. Presuppositionless presuppositions. So, and here at the latest, we know that Ethan's book is on the one hand about an intellectual history about Levinas, as I already said, but on the other hand, also with Levinas about the question of the possibility of history at all. And it is with Levinas about the ethical dimensions of history and the historical. I would like to tell you here very briefly one story that Ethan found in a Talmud lecture of Levinas, and which Levinas found in turn in the tractate Berakotz. The story is about Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who replaced Rabban Gamliel as head of the rabbinical academy because the latter had been too strict. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah possessed wisdom, material independence and ability, but he was only 18 years old and without a gray hair. Wasn't that too much of innovation and renewal? Did Rabbi Eliezer have sufficient experience, and was he able to continue the tradition? It needed a miracle, and the miracle happened, because 18 strands of gray hair appeared on Rabbi Eliezer's head, so that at the age of 18 he already looked like a 70-year-old man. The miracle established a link between tradition and innovation, and the story about this miracle shows other possibilities, even other necessities for dealing with time, in the spirit of the Talmud's model of time. If the past is to acquire meaning for the present and the future, then it cannot remain past. That's what the gray hair tells us. With the two columns, with the two modes of representation in the books, which are supposed to enable communication between different perspectives, two models of time also go hand in hand. On the one side, the established, actually already self-evident model of the historical time, and then a Talmudic model of time, which perhaps does not necessarily focus on eternity, but focuses on permanence, on tradition, on exemplariness, and even on time deprivation. Which narrative is the right one, the true one? Ethan makes visible with his form of presentation that it is precisely this question that is no longer at issue, but rather that the possibilities of interpretation are to be opened up. With this form, Ethan turns against the dream of objectivity, according to which, and I quote here again from his book, according to which there should be an experience independent of the process of experiencing, independent of the situational circumstances of space and time. So, my last point, why Levinas, the slight return. Perhaps that is why Levinas. It is worthwhile to turn to this philosopher and also to this Talmud scholar, because he asks the question, and he points to the wound. The wound to which Levinas can draw attention to is the ever necessary questioning of this European Western chimera called reason, together with its Hegelian servant called history. It is to this reason that Levinas, by education, considers himself committed. And at the same time, he distances himself from this rationality and from its history, because both of them also bear a share of responsibility for the fact that Levinas's parents, his brothers, his entire family was wiped out by the Nazis. However, I do not want to fall into a kind of biographism here, and also Levinas, I suspect, would not have wanted to see his thinking and work founded in such a way. The question that could be addressed to historical endeavors from Levinas's direction, and which Ethan so wonderfully demonstrates in his book, is thus addressed to temporality in general. For if we exist in a contradictory relationship to reason, as it was established as a universal value by the Enlightenment, if we, together with Levinas, cannot let go of this reason and rationality, but at the same time can no longer trust it, and if we thus also distrust the idea of a unilinear history in which this reason is supposed to unfold, perhaps then the problem is time itself. Or rather, perhaps it is the dominant notions of time itself inevitably associated with the notions of reason and history. And all three of them together are the problem. Ethan very vividly has demonstrated with his book what it can mean and what it can look like when different understandings of time collide, when other temporalities encounter each other, and when time encounters as an other. In Le Temps et l'autre, Time and the Other, Levinas pointed out that time cannot be understood as a devaluation of eternity, and that the other is also connected with a fundamentally different temporality. The other is the non-simultaneous, which in addition to its non-simultaneity is always characterized by its proximity. Perhaps that is why Levinas, because coming from such a wholly different direction, working and playing with partly wholly different traditions, Levinas can call the attention of all those to their blind spots who think that, for example, there is nothing to be gained by interpreting Talmudic stories. So, that's my comment. Just trying to break it down to 3 concluding questions. I asked them already, just to point them out again. Why Levinas? Second, is it a true story about Levinas? And the third one, maybe, where is Ethan's side apart from God's own side and God on our side?
Wow. So that, chapeau. Did I write that?
Not the command, but what I commented on.
No, it's always exciting and estranging to get the feedback and the comment on what lands from the book, what doesn't land. And in some ways, you answered the why Levinas question. I think it probably better than I could, bringing in your own understandings of temporality. But one way maybe into that, or to try to answer all 3, is to come to something that you suggested because of this seeming, and this goes really to the question of why the introduction and the conclusion are working in this single way, whereas the others are working with the multi-column. Because as you rightly suggest, there is this tension between the secular and the transcendent, which is framed in the sort of assumptions of what I call a secular historical bias, as opposed to this either extendent or transcendent logic at play in Levinas. And you state, I think, absolutely correctly that the transcendence never did leave history. And I think that's actually something that I also take up in the Haunting History book, where I discuss the ways that moving from, say, Cladenius to Droysen to Dilthey, you end up with what I in that call a theologico-historical understanding, where the theology gets sort of dropped out. It's not that it goes away, it's that the methodology allows one to not take up the theological issues that had been driving the train, as it were. And one of the things that I'm trying to do in this book, and the why Levinas, is to sort of demonstrate that the one is always in the other, that transcendent or extra-temporal, but in this case actually it's really a theological understanding, is in the secular historical at the same time. And so the introduction is a sort of owner's manual for the book, and I must confess that that is in part because one of the readers' reports said, you have to tell people how to read this book. It just can't be left on its own. We need a little more. And so it does, I mean, in some ways that is where I come in, although I do drop out as well, right? I actually ventriloquize Levinas and what's said about Levinas a lot. But it is a sort of owner's manual that sets up these poles to pull them apart. That in some ways allows the deconstruction. But then at the end, in the final concluding chapter on what I call constitutive dissymmetry, that's actually the constitution of a self or self-understanding that is both interior to itself and exterior to itself. And so the attempt there is to allow precisely this conflict to not resolve. This isn't Hegelian at all, to not resolve, but in fact to work around each other toward the end. I mean, there's a slightly different question, but it's completely related to the temporality, which has to do with the why we feel we need to conserve not only questions or for Levinas reason, but a particular identity. And for Levinas, he on the one hand wants this radical ethics of alterity, and on the other hand, he wants to conserve a particular Jewish identity, because to give that up, to his mind, in some way, is to capitulate either to the extermination, which was attempted in World War II by the Nazis, or to assimilation, which he sees as an equally pernicious threat. But as a result, he reifies this identitarian position, which is the one he thinks is the source of the problem. And he can't get out of that either. And I think it is in these different logics of temporality that one can actually solve or attempt to solve some of the problems that Levinas himself cannot. And so one reason why Levinas, because he fails, because he sees what he needs to do, but the failure is not irredeemable. It's the fact that he realizes that humans are prone to failure. It's not a utopia, and it's not a God descending to present miracles to us. It's actually somehow an absent God that's given us the coordinates and asks us to work out the coordinates ourselves. And that then the failure is part of that drive, that drive to attempt to take the question further, to not answer it, to not have a resolution, to not have a eschatology, to not have a logic of progress, and not to leave the past in the past. It's the gray hairs, right? You have to, it comes with you into the present, but then you need to take it into the future. It's not even enough to have it in the present. There's work to be done. And I guess that's the why Levinas is that he recognized the work to be done. And I don't know, then you just get obsessed with figures as you work on them, and that draws us too, so. Und.
Danke. Thank you so much.